The little hand appeared first, white in the brown floodwater, opening and closing beneath the broken wagon seat like it was trying to catch hold of the rain itself. Eli Mercer saw it from the saddle and threw his loop before he had time to think about the depth of the wash or the way his horse was already sliding in the mud. The rope went taut. The wagon groaned. Somewhere under the crash of water a child screamed once, then bit it off short, the way frightened children do when they've learned noise doesn't always bring help. He swung down into water cold enough to knife through wool and denim in a single breath. The current shoved hard at his knees. A mule kicked blind inside the traces. Eli cut the harness with one pull of his knife, ducked under the tilted seat, and found a little girl wedged in the dark pocket between the axle and a flour sack gone to paste. Her eyes were open. That was the worst part. Open and steady, as if she had already decided this was simply what the world did to small things. He tucked her beneath one arm, braced his shoulder against the wagon, and shouted to the boy still clinging to the tailboard to jump when he said jump. Behind him, thunder rolled low across the flats, and the whole wash smelled of torn sage, wet leather, and mule blood. And before I tell you what Eli did with that child in his arms and 3 more lives slipping sideways in the storm, tell me where you're listening from tonight, because stories like this travel farther when they know whose lamp is still burning for them. The boy jumped late. Eli caught him anyway. A girl about 12 came next, dragging another little one by the dress. By the time he got them all to the bank, the wagon had rolled clean over and the man who'd been driving it was gone under. Eli went back once for him because decent men do, even when they know the river has already made up its mind. He found the woman instead, pinned by the sideboard in water up to her mouth, her fingers still locked around a tin document box she must have been trying to hold above the current. He wrenched the box free, dragged her out by the coat, and carried her to the bank where the children stood in a ragged line, shivering so hard their teeth clicked like castanets. She took one breath that sounded like paper tearing, then another. Her eyes found the children before they found him. "The papers," she whispered. He put the box against her chest. She shook her head, once, impatient even then. "Keep them dry." That was all. Her hand slipped off the tin and into the mud. The oldest girl made no sound. She only stepped forward and pulled the smallest child back against her skirts so the little one would not see more than she already had. Eli noticed things like that. He noticed the way the boy tried to stand between the dead and the others while his own knees trembled. He noticed the little dark-haired girl at the oldest one's side, holding a cracked blue china hen so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. He noticed that the smallest child, the one he had pulled from under the wagon, had lost one shoe and still had not started crying. It was the kind of quiet that came from long practice, not bravery. He got them onto his horse in shifts, then walked beside them the 5 miles into Medicine Bow with the reins wrapped twice around his numb hand. Rain beat down and ran off his hat brim in steady cold threads. The little girl in front of him finally leaned her damp head against his shoulder as if she had done it 100 times before. He felt the slight weight of her and had to look away into the weather because memory could come on a man that fast if he wasn't careful. Once, 12 years earlier, another small head had fit just there. Once, he had thought there would be time enough to get back. By the time the doctor and the town women had carried the children inside and laid the parents out in the back room of Henshaw's surgery beneath clean sheets, the rain had thinned to a fine, mean drizzle. Medicine Bow smelled of coal smoke, wet plank sidewalks, and horses blowing steam into the cooling dark. Eli stood just inside the doorway with his hat in both hands while Mrs. Henshaw heated broth and a widow from the boarding house upstairs fetched dry clothes from her own linen chest without waiting to be asked. Her name was Ruth Whitlow. Eli knew that much. Everybody in town knew her. She moved through a room the way women do who have had grief burn all the fuss out of them. Useful hands, quiet feet, brown hair pinned tight, a face that might have been called pretty once and maybe still was, if you looked at it long enough to see what endurance had made of it. The doctor came out wiping his spectacles. Father was Jonah Kittredge. Mother was Martha. Homestead folk from Willow Creek. I've seen the names on vaccination day. How many? Eli asked. 4 living. Henshaw nodded toward the little room. Ada, Ben, Lucy, and the baby one. June. Any kin? Not near enough to matter by morning. It was Ruth who answered the question Eli had not asked yet. County will hold them at the church house until a placement hearing. Judge Talbot tries to keep siblings together when he can. When he can, Henshaw repeated in the tired way of a man who had watched the law run out of mercy before. The oldest girl, Ada, came to the door in a nightdress too big for her, one sleeve rolled 3 times. Her hair had dried in rough, dark ropes around her face. Ben says the creek took Pa's team. Are we meant to go back for the hens? For a second, nobody spoke. Eli looked at Ruth. Ruth looked at the floorboards. Finally, the doctor said, "No one's going back tonight." Ada nodded as if she were accepting an order in a language she did not entirely understand, but had no time to question. Then I ought to ask about the baby's shoe. That broke something in Ruth. Not visibly, just enough that her next movement was slower. She crouched to Ada's height and said, "I'll find her another pair." The smallest one was sitting on the edge of the examination table wrapped in a gray blanket that swallowed her whole. Her feet were bare. One ankle had a line of bruising dark as plum skin. When Eli stepped into the room to leave the dry tin box on the counter, she looked up at him as if he were the same fixed fact as the door or the stove. Not hope, not trust, something smaller and older than either. Ruth was buttoning the child into a borrowed flannel gown when Mrs. Curnow from the store said gently, "You'll likely sleep in the church house a night or 2, lamb, till the judge decides." June glanced at Ada, then at Ben, then at Lucy with the china hen in her lap. Her mouth trembled once, more from effort than fear. "Can we stay together?" Nobody answered right away. The room had gone so still Eli could hear rainwater dripping from the cuff of his coat onto the boards. Henshaw cleared his throat and failed to make a sound of it. Mrs. Curnow pressed her lips together. Ada stood straighter, braced already for whatever fresh hurt was coming. The child looked back at Eli because he was the one who had gone into the river. To a frightened 5-year-old, that was as good as authority. He had a bed above the livery, $60 saved in a tobacco tin, a fall contract riding south with the bar circle at first light, and no business in this story at all. But the child had asked him like the world might still be bargained with. He could not say no. He took off his hat, because somehow that felt like telling the truth, and said, "Yes, ma'am. We'll see it done." By morning the rain had moved east and left the town scrubbed raw under a hard blue Wyoming sky. Mud sucked at boots in the alleyways. Clotheslines snapped wet in the wind. Medicine Bow woke to its usual noises. Wagon wheels over planks, a hammer at the blacksmith, the noon train whistling thin as a hawk somewhere past the grain sheds. But word of the Kittredge children traveled ahead of all of it. By breakfast, men at the livery were saying the oldest boy would do well on Pike land, and the girls could be placed with decent housewives before winter. They said it the way people discuss crates and calves, not because they were cruel exactly, but because distance is easier when you believe necessity has already done the deciding. Eli sat on an upturned bucket beside the hitch rail and listened while he rubbed down his bay gelding, Hob, with long, even strokes. Horses liked him because he never lied with his hands. A sorrel colt in the next stall had been striking at everyone for 3 days. Eli put a palm to the colt's neck, waded through the shiver and the stiff-legged sidestep, then worked the burr snag beneath the throat latch free without ever tightening his fingers. Ben Kittredge, who had been watching from the stable door with that half-starved, wary look boys get when they're trying to learn what kind of man they're standing near, said, "He didn't even bite you." "He thought on it," Eli said. Ben almost smiled. There was the matter of the law. Judge Talbot could delay placement a few days, maybe a week, but not through a Wyoming winter on good intentions. Eli learned the rest from Ruth in the boarding house kitchen while the children ate biscuits so fast he had to tell them to slow down or regret it later. She had rolled up her sleeves. Flour dusted the backs of her hands. A kettle ticked on the iron range, and the room smelled of yeast, coffee, and wood smoke soaked deep into old pine. "Pike holds the note on the Kittredge place," she said. "Seed, wagon repairs, feed last winter. He's already sent word the estate owes him." Harlan Pike, Eli said. Everybody from Laramie to Rawlins knew the name. Cattle, hay, freight contracts, 300 favors called in and never forgotten. Ruth nodded. "He sits county board too. Not the judge, but close enough to trouble." "How much trouble?" "Enough that if those children look like a burden instead of a family, he'll see them divided before Sunday." Eli leaned one shoulder to the table and watched June licking honey off a cracked spoon. Ada kept passing the best pieces of biscuit to the younger two when she thought nobody noticed. Ruth noticed. She said nothing. That was another thing Eli marked. I ride south with the bar circle by noon, he said. Ruth's hands stilled in the dough. She did not look at him. Then you'd best make peace with breaking that child's heart early. He had meant it as fact, not defense, but the words landed anyhow. I gave my word. Men do. Lucy looked up from her plate, sensing the weather in the room. Eli reached over and moved the jam crock closer to her without thinking. Ruth saw that too. There's a hearing Friday, she said after a moment. If someone petitions temporary guardianship, proves a winter roof, and shows some means of support, Talbot can keep them together pending the estate matter. What kind of means? A bond. $100. More if Pike pushes. Eli had 63 and a southbound contract that would bring another 100 by Christmas if he took it. He could leave, keep the money, keep the clean loneliness he understood, and let town and law sort the rest. Or he could stay, lose the contract, spend every saved dollar he had on children who did not belong to him, and maybe still fail. Easy and Ryder rarely can. He knew that better than most. He pushed away from the table. Where's Talbot hold court? By noon his saddle was still in the livery, his bedroll still rolled, and his place with the bar circle given to a red-headed hand named Fosdick, who never even had the grace to look apologetic. Judge Talbot heard Eli out in shirt sleeves with his suspenders hanging and dust on his spectacles. The judge was old enough to have grown careful where other men grew soft. He asked practical questions. Income, lodging, church standing, relation to the children. Eli could answer only one cleanly. No relation. Then why you? Eli looked through the office window where Ben and June sat on the hitch rail outside, Ben tying and untying the lace on her borrowed shoe to keep her occupied. Because she asked. Talbot exhaled through his nose. It might have been a laugh if he'd been built for such things. That is not a legal argument, Mr. Mercer. No, sir. Still the best one I've heard all day. Temporary petition filed. Eli walked out with a paper in his pocket and a week to become the sort of man a county would trust with for frightened children. Harlan Pike was waiting at the far end of the boardwalk as if he had known to the minute when the talk would finish. He was broad through the middle now, wearing good black wool and polished boots that had not seen real manure in years. His mustache was trimmed neat as account book lines. Power sat easy on him. That was what made him dangerous. He didn't have to shout. The town had already done enough listening. Mercer, he said, heard you've taken an interest in the Kittredge situation. Eli kept walking. Pike fell in beside him. Jonah owed me $212. Pike went on. With feed and interest, more by now. Sad business, drowning like that. Sadder still when children get dragged into adult debts. I can place the boy with my winter hands. Good meat, good work. The older girl would do for Mrs. Havers. The other two, they stay together. Pike smiled without warmth. A drifter says so, and the world remakes itself. I'm no drifter this week. Then what are you? Eli stopped. The wind carried cold dust from the tracks and slapped it against the store windows. Across the street, Ruth came out with a crate of turnips balanced on one hip and paused when she saw them. Pike noticed her look and tucked the information away. Eli said, a man who means to keep his word. Pike studied him a beat too long. Words are cheaper than oats, Mercer. Then he glanced past him to where Ada had gathered the younger girls close against her skirt, and Ben stood with a stick in his fist like he'd use it if he had to. Friday then. That afternoon Eli took the children out to Willow Creek in a borrowed wagon to see what was left of the Kittredge place. The road ran over open land the color of old gold, sage silvering at the edges where the wind turned it. A pair of antelope flashed white and were gone. June fell asleep with her cheek against the seatboard. Ruth had packed cold potatoes, cheese, and a jar of blackberry preserves and sent them along without message. Eli found himself thinking about that more than he meant to. The homestead sat low beside the creek, a two-room house with a leaning porch, one shed, a chicken run half torn down, and 3 cottonwoods already starting to yellow at the leaves. There was damage from the flood. A side fence gone, one shutter hanging, mud laced across the yard in crooked drying seams. But there was also a stack of cut wood under tarp, potatoes mounded in a cellar pit, and a milk cow bawling thin but alive from the far enclosure. Martha Kittredge had left the world in the middle of working to remain in it. You could feel that in the place. Ben ran to the shed, Ada to the house. Lucy set her china hen on the porch rail like she was putting something precious back where it belonged. Eli followed more slowly, carrying June. Inside, the room smelled of wet plaster, lamp oil, and the stale sweetness of apples stored too long. Bed still unmade. A shirt across a chair. A Bible open face down on the table where someone had meant to come right back to it. June stirred against his shoulder and looked around in that grave way of hers. Is this still ours? It can be, he said. Ada turned from the table, holding a bundle of school slates tied in a rag. Her chin lifted. She had her mother's way of saving fear for private use. If Mr. Pike takes the land, they'll say we've nowhere proper. Then we give him proper, Eli said. They worked till the light went copper and low. Ben reset fence posts with Eli and learned quickly which end of a mall to trust. Ada swept mud and glass out of the front room with strokes fierce enough to count as prayer. Lucy collected eggs from the surviving hens and spoke to each one under her breath, like introductions mattered. June sat on the porch step holding nails in the pocket of her apron and passed them over one by one as solemnly as communion. When Ada apologized at dusk for not doing more, Eli set the hammer down and looked at her square. A child asking to stay with her own blood ought not sound like she's begging. She stared at him, and for the first time since the river her mouth gave way at the corners. Not a smile exactly, more like a piece of her deciding it might survive. By the third day the town had arranged itself into the sides it always would have chosen if grief hadn't embarrassed it for a moment. Mrs. Curnow sent flour on credit and pretended not to notice Ruth paying for it later from the boarding house till. The preacher offered verses and 2 broken chairs. Beale the blacksmith said children needed a father, not scripture, but shoot Hob for half price anyhow. Pike shut Eli out of day wages at the yard and bought up the contract on a string of broncs Eli had meant to gentle for the stage line. Men who had clapped him on the shoulder last month suddenly found urgent business when he came near. A town can turn on silence faster than on anger. Ruth did not turn. Each morning she came out to Willow Creek in her brother's old buckboard with food under a cloth and some practical item nobody had thought to name until they needed it. Curtain wire, lamp chimneys, a pot big enough for stew, blue thread for mending, school copybooks with one corner damp from the shop. She never stayed long the first few days. She moved through the house taking measure of what hurt and what might still serve, then left before gratitude could make the children shy. On Thursday, she brought a box of winter apples and found Eli on the porch teaching Ben how to clean tack with warm tallow. Judge won't care if the straps shine, she said. Boy might. Ben kept working and tried not to look pleased. Ruth stepped inside where Ada was patching a torn quilt and Lucy was reciting some off a slate. June slept under the table with the blue china hen tucked beneath one arm. Ruth's face changed in that small, dangerous way a lonely person's face changes when they begin to picture absence as lost before they've admitted attachment at all. You'll need school records, she said to Ada. I can cipher, Ada replied. I don't doubt it. The law may. They spent the afternoon gathering papers. The dry tin box from the river held the land filing, 2 tax receipts, a marriage certificate, and a packet of letters tied with faded ribbon. No note to Pike. No clear accounting. Ada grew pale as she sorted through them. Ma kept more. Pa had a ledger. Where? She swallowed. He took it to town in the wagon. Maybe the river had it. Maybe Pike did. Maybe it was lying open in creek mud with all the proof washed right out of it. Eli felt the pressure of time, narrowing like a cinch drawn one hole too far. That evening Harlan Pike rode out with Deputy Sloan and stood at the gate without dismounting. The sun was down behind him, leaving his face in shadow and his silver watch chain bright. Just a courtesy call, he said, to inspect conditions. He looked past Eli into the yard where Ben was bringing in wood and Ada had June on her hip. Ruth had not yet driven back to town. She stood on the porch in her plain dark dress with flowers still on one sleeve, and there was something in the sight of her there that made the place appear more like a home than it had any legal right to be. Pike saw that too. Mrs. Whitlow, he said smoothly, didn't expect to find you keeping house. I'm bringing supper to children, she answered. It's still legal, last I heard. For now. Deputy Sloan shuffled, embarrassed by the taste of his own work. Pike unfolded a paper. Notice of claim against estate. Also notice that temporary custody hearing has been moved up to tomorrow morning. Weather coming in. Talbot means to settle matters before the roads close. Eli took the paper. Over Pike's shoulder, the western sky had gone a flat iron color that promised snow by dawn. Pike gathered his reins. 1 week wasn't long enough, Mercer. You've got a roof and some sentiment. That is not a life. After he rode off, the wind lifted and began to worry the cottonwoods. The leaves rattled like dry bones. Ben came to Eli with the maul still in both hands and asked, low enough not to carry to the girls, if he takes us tomorrow, do we got to go where he says? Eli looked at the boy, at the field Jonah Kittredge had nearly finished fencing, at Ruth on the porch with June's hair caught in her hand as she untangled a knot with patient fingers. Not if I can help it. And it is worth asking yourself here what a promise is worth when keeping it costs the only life you know. Because that is the kind of question that separates decent men from useful ones, and the world has never lacked for useful ones. Snow came in the night sideways and mean. By morning it had drifted under the porch and banked white against the shed door. Eli was up before light, splitting kindling with numb hands while the kettle hissed inside. The hearing was at 10, but road or no road, they still needed breakfast, still needed boots warmed by the stove, still needed the ordinary mercies weather never pauses to consider. Ruth had stayed the night in the front room with the girls after the first hard gusts started shaking the walls. She came out now with her hair loose down her back, not from vanity, but because there had been no point pinning it again after sleeping in a chair. That single human untidiness did more to unsettle Eli than any polished prettiness could have done. June had a fever flush along her cheekbones. Lucy coughed. Ada kept watching the window, as if the law might come riding through it. Ben tried to carry wood 2 sticks at a time, because Eli did. We should leave now, Ruth said. We won't make the ford with the buckboard. Then horseback. With June burning like that. Eli shook his head. I can take 1. Not 4. Ruth looked toward the table where the petition paper lay beside the dry tin box. The whole of their argument reduced to a handful of documents, and what witnesses could be made to brave a storm. If we miss it, Talbot will call it abandonment. Then I don't miss it. He saddled Hob in the blowing dark while snow needled under his collar and stuck in his lashes. He intended to ride in alone, argue for a continuance, and get back before the children had time to fear what absence meant. That was the plan. Plans have a way of failing precisely where old guilt lives. As he cinched up, June appeared in the doorway wrapped in a blanket, barefoot despite all Ruth's efforts. The child stood in the blue half-light with steam from her fever lifting faint from her hair. You ain't coming back late? She asked. He froze with one hand on the latigo. There it was. Not the same words. The same wound. 12 years earlier his own daughter, Mary Ellen, had stood at a cabin door in Colorado with scarlet fever on her lips and asked if he'd be back before dark. He had ridden for the doctor because the storm had not yet broken, and because money for the doctor had to come from somewhere, and because good intentions are poor blankets when a child is burning up. The river crossing swelled. The doctor turned back. By the time Eli returned, the cabin was quiet in the way houses should never be quiet again. He had kept walking ever since. Now June watched him with that terrible patience children wear when they are trying to be easy to leave. He unsaddled Hob. Ruth said nothing until he turned back toward the house. Then, very softly, you know what that costs. Yes, ma'am. By 8 o'clock, Pike's man Amos Creed rode into the yard with 2 ranch hands and a bill of attachment for the milk cow, the wagon tongue, and any saleable tools remaining on the Kittredge place. Eli met them at the gate with the paper already in his fist and the shotgun still hanging untouched above Jonah's mantle inside the house. Amos was a long-jawed boy with too much whisker to be trusted and not enough age to have learned shame. He kept glancing past Eli at the children in the window. Just collecting property against debt, Amos said. In a blizzard. Debt don't thaw in spring. Eli could have bloodied him. Might even have enjoyed it for half a second. Instead, he stood with snow gathering on his shoulders and said, You take 1 step through that gate, and I drag you back out by your boot heels in front of every child here. Amos shifted in the saddle. One of the other men looked away first. Not because Eli was the biggest man they knew. Because there is a difference between violence and certainty, and horses and men can smell it. Ruth came to the doorway with June in her arms. Ada stood behind her, pale but upright, and Ben had planted himself at the table with the carving knife gripped so badly it made Eli's heart hurt. Pike's riders saw all of it. Something like discomfort crossed Amos's face. He spat into the snow and backed his horse. Talbot'll sort it. Go let him. They rode off, cursing the cold. That was when Ada, white-lipped and shaking from more than weather, said, I remember where Ma put the other papers. They all turned. She stitched them in my Sunday hem before the river, Ada said. She said if the wagon turned, cloth might hold where wood wouldn't. Ruth set June down and went to the peg where Ada's wet blue dress still hung from the first night. Her hands were steadier than Eli's as she turned the hem and felt along the seam. There, under 2 neat rows of tiny hidden stitches, the fabric went stiff. She fetched her work scissors, snipped carefully, and drew out 3 folded sheets gone soft with damp, but still legible enough. One was Jonah Kittredge's small ledger page torn clean from the book. One was a receipt for payment against Pike's note. The third was a postal money order stub to a bank in Cheyenne, dated 6 weeks back. Ruth read first. Her mouth tightened. He nearly paid it. This shows more than half the claimed debt settled. Nearly ain't fully, Eli said, though hope had already moved under his ribs like a struck match. No, Ruth answered. But it makes Pike a liar or a fool. Ada sat hard in the chair like her knees had given. Ma said papers mattered more than tears. The wind slammed the shutter once, hard enough to make Lucy cry out. Eli looked toward town through the streaming white. 10 miles. Bad roads. A hearing already begun, or nearly. Evidence in hand, and no way to get it there unless someone rode. This time Ruth reached for Hobbs' bridle before he could. I know Talbot. He'll hear me. A woman arriving with fever papers from a dead mother buys time, where a cowboy gets called dramatic. You don't ride that cut in this weather alone. I've done worse. So had he. That was the trouble. He recognized the look on her face because it matched one he'd worn half his adult life. The set jaw of a person too acquainted with loss to leave what they love undefended. In the end, they lashed a canvas over the papers, wrapped Ruth in Eli's oilskin, and put her on the steadier of the 2 farm horses because Hob knew only one gate once turned loose in weather. She leaned down before mounting and tucked the blue china hen from Lucy's hand into the child's apron pocket. For luck, Lucy whispered. For coming back, Ruth said. She rode out into a world reduced to white breath and dark fence posts. Eli stood in the yard until horse and rider were swallowed whole. Then he went inside because staying at the door had never yet brought anyone home faster. The rest of the day narrowed to immediate things. June's fever climbed. Eli cooled cloths in snow water and laid them across her wrists while Lucy dozed upright by the stove with her hen in her lap. Ben and Ada helped him lash the loose shutter and bank the fire. At one point the shed roof groaned under drift weight, and Eli was out with a shovel, clearing it between gusts so fierce they drove ice crystals into his eyes like grit. In the middle of that white roar he paused once. One hand braced on the handle, and understood with awful clarity what was about to happen if Ruth did not get through, if Talbot ruled without them. If Pike's men came with papers stronger than promises, he might lose them all while doing everything right. That is a colder fear than death. Death ends. Failure keeps talking. Near dusk the storm eased enough for shape to return to the world. A rider came at last, not Ruth, but Deputy Sloan under a crust of snow with his scarf frozen solid. Eli met him halfway to the gate, every muscle ready. She made it. Sloan called before he was near enough to see Eli's face. Talbot held the matter till morning. Roads are impassable. Pike is fit to swallow nails. And Ruth. At Mrs. Curnow's stove, near as I know. Talbot says bring every paper you've got, and every soul who can stand upright at 9 sharp. Says if you miss that, he'll do what the county requires. Sloan hesitated, then held out a folded note gone damp at the edges. The handwriting was Ruth's, firm even in a storm. Eli opened it with hands that had forgotten how to be gentle. June's fever wants watching. Use willow bark from the jar on the second shelf. And Eli, come tomorrow clean-shaven if you can. Men listen foolishly better to a tidy face. At the bottom, smaller, she had added, I kept sitting here. He read that line twice in the failing light before folding it back into his pocket. Morning came clear and cruel. Every drift turned gold by a sun too bright to trust. The world after snow always looked innocent in a way Eli resented. June's fever had broken sometime before dawn. She woke weak and limp against the pillow and asked first for toast, which made Ruth's absent instructions sound like scripture. They washed the children in warm water, brushed their hair, and dressed them in their best pieced-together clothes. Eli shaved with Jonah's razor by a mirror gone black at the corners and nicked his jaw twice because his hand would not settle. When Ruth arrived in Mrs. Curnow's sleigh with blankets over her knees and exhaustion around her eyes, the whole room changed shape at once. June sat straight up in bed. Lucy grinned. Even Ben, who had been trying very hard to be 12 all week instead of 11, let his shoulders down. Ruth crossed to the stove and put her gloves to warm. Talbot gave us till noon. Pike has his ledger. I have Mrs. Curnow, the postmaster, and an opinion of Harlan Pike that grows less Christian by the hour. She was pale from the ride and from a night with too little sleep, but there was color high in her face too, the kind courage sometimes gives the tired. Eli took the kettle from her before she could reach for it. Their fingers touched. Both withdrew more slowly than the task required. He said, "You shouldn't have had to do that." "No," she said. "You shouldn't have had to go into that river." Still, here we are. There were too many children in the room for the silence that followed to become anything foolish, so it became useful instead. Ruth checked June's forehead. Ada folded the papers in order. Ben practiced saying, "Yes, sir," without swallowing the words. Lucy polished the china hen with the corner of her apron till it shone blue as creek ice. On the way to town, the sleigh runners hissed overpacked snow. The air smelled clean enough to hurt. Eli walked beside the horse to spare the children the jolting, and because motion kept his mind from racing ahead into catastrophe. Ruth sat up front with the reins, one mitten wrapped around leather, the other bracing June under the blanket. After a mile, she said, not looking at him, "I buried my husband in weather like this." Eli glanced up. "Boiler burst at the freight yard," she went on. "Steam burned him before I got there. Folks brought casseroles and verses for 6 weeks, and then expected me to become one of those women who lives entirely in sepia memory. I nearly obliged them, nearly made a religion of being left." The sleigh bells gave a soft, irregular clink. Eli let her keep the pace of it. "I had a son once too," she said. "4 years old. Winter cough. Not enough doctor. I stopped setting an extra plate after that because I thought if I made the house smaller, the missing would take less room in it. It doesn't work that way." He walked another 10 paces before answering. "No." She looked down at him then, really looked, and perhaps saw in his face the same old architecture of damage she carried in her own. "Was it your wife?" she asked. "And a girl." He did not say Mary Ellen's name. Some griefs remained too warm to handle barehanded. Ruth nodded once, emotion so small it felt more like recognition than sympathy. The lonely don't need saving half so much as they need someone to keep sitting there. The words landed in him with the soft authority of truth, not trying to impress anybody. Ahead, medicine bough smoked faint in the clear cold, church steeple and freight roofs rising from the white. Behind them, the children had gone quiet, listening, each one old enough in sorrow to know when adults were speaking the language that matters. At the bank, old Mr. Lyle took Eli aside while the others were still climbing down. Frost whitened his beard. "Heard you need surety," he muttered. "If you sign the Kittredge acreage over into your name, pending majority, I can float you the balance against the bond. Cleaner paperwork. Children never know the difference." Eli looked through the window where Ada was straightening June's collar and Ben was knocking snow from Ruth's hem with careful mittened hands. He could do it. Win clean and sort fairness later. Plenty of men would. Maybe even good men. "No," he said. Lyle blinked. "You'd rather lose them than hold land you'll likely improve yourself?" "It isn't mine." Ruth was standing 3 steps away. She had heard every word. She said nothing, but the expression that crossed her face was the one a person wears when something hoped for in secret turns out to be true in daylight. If what just passed between them brushed somewhere tender in you, stay with us a while longer. Leave a like, stay subscribed, and make room for more stories that remember quiet goodness is still goodness, because the world gets loud enough on its own. Judge Talbot held the hearing in the church hall because the courthouse stove had gone out. The place smelled of wool coats drying, lamp oil, and old hymnals. Half the town had found a reason to be there. Some came for decency, some for spectacle. Pike sat at the long table near the front with his ledger, his lawyer from Rollins, and the expression of a man already measuring curtains for someone else's house. He glanced once at Ruth, once at Eli, then settled his gaze on the children as if dividing them by usefulness. Talbot heard Pike first. "Dead-owed. No blood relation. Mr. Mercer an itinerant hand with no fixed property. Mrs. Whitlow respectable but alone, running a boarding house not suitable for 4 minors. Winter hardship. Better to place the children separately where they might each be provided for. Pike made it sound almost noble, the way selfish men do when they dress hunger in orderly language. Then Talbot called Ada. She walked forward with June's hand in one of hers and Lucy's in the other, Ben at her shoulder, and stood straighter than many grown women do at their own wedding vows. When asked who had fed them, taught them, and kept them warm since the river, she answered without embellishment. Mr. Mercer did the mending and the wood and most of the not sleeping. Mrs. Whitlow did the things that made it feel like we were still people. A soft sound moved through the room. Pike's lawyer objected to sentiment. Talbot let it stand. The postmaster came next and produced the money order register showing Jonah Kittredge's payment sent on the date of the stub Ada had carried in her hem. Mrs. Curnow brought her counterbook with flour, seed, and lamp oil marked paid in Martha's hand. Ruth produced the stitched papers from the dress hem. Henshaw testified that Martha's first dying concern had been the document box. Beale the blacksmith, to everybody's surprise including perhaps his own, said he had seen Jonah settle 2 accounts with Pike in September and had remarked at the time that a poor man's debts traveled slower than a rich man's memory. Pike objected, smoothed his mustache, objected again. But something had already changed in the room. Not all at once. More like thaw creeping under a fence line. Facts began leaning one way, then people did. Talbot took Pike's ledger, compared the entries with the money order dates, and asked 3 short questions in a tone so mild it was more dangerous than anger. Pike answered the first smoothly, the second too quickly, and the third not at all. And the children? Talbot said at last. You seek the estate, Mr. Pike, and propose to split the heirs from one another for their own good? Pike drew himself up. For their practical care, yes. Ben spoke before anyone could stop him. You wanted my hands and the creek more in you wanted care. The lawyer snapped for silence. Talbot did not. Then Eli was called. He stood in front of the table with Ruth and the children behind him and felt every eye in medicine bow resting somewhere between his throat and his scars. Talbot asked about income. Eli answered with the winter-breaking contract Beale had secured him that very morning with a ranch south of town, enough to keep food on a table and boots on growing feet. Asked about lodging, Ruth spoke plainly that her house had 2 unused rooms already occupied in spirit if not by law, and that spring work had begun on repairing the Willow Creek place for the children's future. Asked why he had refused the bank's easier arrangement, Eli told the truth because by then it seemed the only currency left worth spending. They've lost enough without me taking their name off what little's theirs, he said. Talbot leaned back. And what exactly are you asking this court for, Mr. Mercer? Eli looked at the children. June had her thumb tucked against her palm the way frightened little ones do when they're trying not to show it. Ada's jaw was set hard enough to ache. Lucy clutched the blue hen. Ben stood like he intended to memorize this moment forever. Then Eli looked at Ruth, who met his gaze with no flinching in it at all. I'm asking you not to make children pay adult debts, he said. I'm asking you to leave a family where it still exists. And if the law requires a name on that duty, use mine. Talbot was quiet a long time. Outside, somewhere beyond the church walls, a train whistled west. When he finally spoke, it was to Pike. Your claim against the estate will be revised in light of these receipts. Until then, no property transfer. As for placement, this court finds the county's first duty is preservation of the sibling household where reasonably possible. Mrs. Whitlow's residence and Mr. Mercer's petition together satisfy that possibility. Temporary guardianship granted jointly until spring review, with estate rights held in the children's names. The room exhaled. Talbot lifted one finger. And Mr. Pike, next time you bring me a ledger, bring me one that doesn't need explaining. Pike did not argue. That was the only dignity left to him, and to his credit or his pride, he kept it. He gathered his papers with measured hands, nodded once to no one in particular, and walked out while the town's attention drifted away from him like smoke leaving a dead fire. Some men are punished loud. Others simply discover the world has stopped arranging itself around their appetite. Practical matters came after. Mrs. Curnow insisted on delivering supper that night, though Ruth protested there were already potatoes enough. Beale brought window glass. Henshaw checked June's lungs one more time and declared her stubborn, which passed for health in Wyoming. The preacher offered a blessing over the children, and June asked if blessings wore off in bad weather. That made Talbot laugh outright for the first time anybody there had likely seen. Spring took its time. Snow melted into the wheel ruts, then into Willow Creek, and the cottonwoods leafed green again. The boarding house filled and emptied around the constant noise of children being children. Eli worked horses through the thaw, came home smelling of sweat, leather, and sage, and learned the strange depth of pleasure in hearing four separate voices race to tell him one useless thing apiece before he had even got his gloves off. Ruth taught Lucy to read from seed catalogs and Ben to write his sums straight. Ada, relieved at last of being the whole roof over everybody's head, began looking 13 in the ordinary ways again, rolling her eyes at mending, laughing too loud with other girls after church, standing longer than necessary by the mirror with a ribbon. By June, they were spending most days out at Willow Creek, raising the porch, resetting the fences, and planting a kitchen garden where Martha Kittredge had meant to plant one herself. Ruth moved through the place as if she had always known where extra spoons ought to live. Eli never mentioned the fact that she had started leaving one lamp burning in the front window after dusk when he was late from town. Some things did not need naming to become true. Late that summer, with the creek low and clear and the children asleep in rooms that no longer smelled of lost first and living second, Eli found Ruth on the porch shelling peas into a blue bowl. He sat beside her. Their shoulders touched. That was all at first. She said, "They'll ask eventually." "About what?" "Whether you mean to stay." He watched moths worry the lamp glass. Inside, Ben snored once and turned over. "I've been staying for months." "That isn't what children ask." No, it wasn't. He knew that now. He thought of the river, of a little white hand in brown water, of a promise made before he understood how badly he needed it himself. Then he took the pea bowl from Ruth's lap, set it aside, and covered her work-worn hand with his own. Years later, when folks in Medicine Bow spoke of the Kittredge place, they did not speak of the flood first. They spoke of the orchard Ben planted crooked and then corrected, of Lucy, grown and stern over schoolbooks, keeping children after class till every last one could read a headline clean, of Ada marrying a railroad clerk with gentle hands, but refusing to leave the creek more than 20 miles because she said some routes take honestly only once, of June, smallest of them all, riding the gray mare bareback to the mailbox and back with her braids flying, certain the whole valley had been built precisely to keep its word to her. One evening in early autumn, when the light lay honey-thick across the pasture and the cottonwoods whispered above the porch, Eli came in from the lower fence to find Ruth at the table and all four children leaning over a school atlas arguing about oceans they might never see. June looked up first and grinned as if his return was still the best part of any day. He set his hat on the peg, crossed the room, and kissed Ruth's temple while the bread cooled and the lamp came warm in the window, and he thought, not for the first time, that home is the place that keeps your name warm till you get back to it. Next time I'll tell you about the widow who hired a one-eyed stranger to dig a well on land everyone said was cursed, and what rose out of that dry ground before winter. Until then, keep your lamp lit and your heart open.